Baby Pokemon are at the core of the base Neo format. You will not find a competitive base Neo deck that doesn't run at least one baby Pokemon in it. But I still get questions about when it is proper to use certain baby Pokemon over others, and so in this video I would like to explore when and how to utilize each of the baby Pokemon that was released in the Neo era. So let's start with the most widely used and most important baby Pokemon to this format, that being Cleffa. But before getting into the specifics of Cleffa and its Eek attack, we should go over the baby effect that is attached to all of these baby Pokemon in the Neo block, which is, if your baby Pokemon is your active Pokemon and your opponent tries to attack it, your opponent has to flip a coin, and if tails, no part of that attack happens. No matter what the attack is, no matter what it does, if they flip tails, their turn is over. No part of their attacking phase even occurs, which is huge. That means that no matter what kind of attack your opponent has spent time setting up, if they just get the coin flip wrong, then it's all for nothing and they have to wait until next turn to try it again. And let's say you put a Focus Band on a baby Pokemon. Focus Band is another widely used card in this format. That means your opponent's gonna have to flip another coin to knock out that baby Pokemon, so potentially your opponent's gonna have to hit 2 heads just to deal 30 damage and get rid of one of these things. So it's no wonder that baby Pokemon alone shifted the entire format into a more stall-focused format because of the sheer utility of that baby effect, and it could be compounded with other cards like Focus Band. Now on top of that, you look at Cleffa's Eek attack, which is just shuffle your hand into your deck and draw 7 cards, which seems pretty basic, but the only time that you are going to be utilizing Cleffa is in your first few turns. That's why most decks run a full playset, is so they can make sure they get at least one Cleffa in their hand to start the game, because what you can do with that is play as many cards from your hand as you want to. You can even play a Professor Elm or Professor Oak that turn, get a refreshed hand, play even more cards from that, and then you're going to be able to Eek and get even more cards in your hand. So Cleffa is the #1 way to get your setup and everything you need for the rest of the game on turn 1. So if you are building deck lists based off of just what I present in the videos, know that you're not meant to use a Cleffa after turn 1 or 2. Once you get an Eek off and you get everything you need, that Cleffa goes to the bench. Use that free retreat to get it onto the bench and then try to protect it as much as you can, because once a baby Pokemon is on your bench, the baby effect no longer applies and that Cleffa can be sniped. So you run a full playset of Cleffa so that you can ensure that you have one in your opening hand. But then what do you do with the other 3 Cleffa that are in your deck? Well, that's just fodder for using things like Computer Search or Item Finder that you can just discard without thinking about. Unless you just really need another stall card to put in the active position while you set up something on your bench. One thing that will happen a lot is 2 Cleffas will start the game against one another, and you still have to flip a coin to see if you can use Eek. So what happens sometime is you don't get to use Eek because of a bad coin flip, and you have to wait until next turn. While on the other hand, your opponent may be hitting heads and they get a much faster setup. That's why it's still important to run cards like Professor Elm that do the same thing as Eek, and that way you don't have to rely on Cleffa as much. And you'll notice that Eek has 7 E's in it, which makes sense that it lets you draw 7 cards. So if you have a Cleffa with an Eek attack that only has 2 E's, of course that's going to let you draw 2 cards. With an effect this small, promo Cleffa isn't really worth using in any situation, especially since there's a much better Cleffa in the Neo Genesis one. So really the only use I can think of for promo Cleffa is if you really just need proxy Cleffas for Neo Genesis Cleffa, because they're super expensive. So let's move on to the next one, which is Pichu, a card that saw tons and tons of play very early in base Neo when so many of the huge archetypes of the format used Pokemon powers. You had a ton. You had Dodrio, Noctowl, Dark Crobat, Feraligatr, Muk, Aerodactyl, and so Pichu could be a huge threat. If you moved it into the active position with a Focus Band on it, you could continuously use Zap and really pile the damage on multiple Pokemon at once with this little Pichu card. For this reason, within the metagame, Pichu was splashed into a lot of decks. They would run 1 or 2 copies of this and use it situationally. But what happened later into the base Neo format was that people moved away from Pokemon powers because cards like Pichu and Muck were becoming too popular. They were in too many decks, and so people started to turn to things like Chansey and Sneasel and Steelix that didn't rely on Pokemon powers. Adding Pichu to a deck is a great way to punish your opponent for relying too heavily on Pokemon powers, but if your opponent's not using them, then Pichu's kind of dead weight, just taking up space in your deck list. By the near end of base Neo, Pichu really just served to punish decks that were still using Dark, Vileplume, and Muck. But as the only holographic baby Pokemon, I gotta say Pichu is a beautiful card. The color work in the actual holographic part of the card is really great, so it's got that going for it. In a lot of decks, Pichu was replaced by Igglybuff because it doesn't rely on an attack. It can just use its Pokemon power Gaze from the bench to shut down the Pokemon power of one specific card, which is what most decks had come to rely on, like having one Aerodactyl or one Dodrio if you wanted to go really rogue. And so Igglybuff was perfect for just shutting down that one Pokemon power for that turn, and you could do that every single turn, and you still got to attack on your turn, so you were effectively shutting down that specific Pokemon power and still able to do everything else that your deck was built to do. However, the major flaw with Igglybuff is that it does rely on a Pokemon power, and so it can be shut down by Muck, and ironically can be hit with Pichu's Zap without having to flip a coin. So mostly Igglybuff was relegated just to evolution decks, where you would just run one copy of it that you could search out really quick if your opponent did play an Aerodactyl, and Igglybuff was pretty much just an Aerodactyl counter from that point forward. But there is some middle ground between Pichu and Igglybuff, which is Magby. Magby's Sputter attack shuts down all Pokemon powers for an entire turn while also dealing 10 damage, but again you are having to rely on Magby as an attacker to do this, and it's going to shut down your own Pokemon powers as well, so it's still not really a counter to Muck. It will shut a Muck's power down, but it's still going to be shutting down all of yours, so you're not gaining anything from it. The primary use for a Magby is to counter opposing decks that can be a huge threat to your own decks that don't use powers. Case in point, Steelix. Steelix is very threatened by Typhlosion builds, and so it would be smart to run a copy or two of Magby. That way you can make it your active Pokemon while you're setting up your Steelixes on the bench, and continuously use Sputter so that your opponent can't get a full setup with their Typhlosion's Pokemon powers. And then when your Steelixes are ready to hit for maximum damage, you can free retreat into them. I will warn you that if you plan on using Magby in a deck and you're using the Wizards of the Coast Rulings Compendium, almost every ruling they make about Magby's Sputter is wrong. They consider the effect of Sputter an effect on Magby that goes away when it moves to the bench, when it in fact is an effect that is on the game. Just be aware that Wizards' interpretation of Sputter are based on gameplay mechanics from Magic the Gathering, and not based on any form of mechanics from the Pokemon TCG. Moving right along to Elekid, this is a card that is great for any deck that requires a few turns of setup. If you find yourself in a situation where you've already used Cleffa's Eek and you got all of the cards you need for setup, you just need a couple more turns to lay down those energy and get your bench Pokemon prepared, well, that's a perfect time to have an Elekid on your bench, because while you are evolving Pokemon on your bench and taking the turns to place energy on them, your active Pokemon is probably most likely a Cleffa against your opponent's Cleffa, meaning that you're going to have to flip a coin just to get an attack through, when you may not even need to Eek. That's where you could just flip a coin and use Elekid from the bench as a form of attack. Or say you have an active Pokemon whose attack requires it to discard energy, and you want to avoid doing that. Instead, you may be able to just use Elekid's Playful Punch to deal the final blow to your opponent's Pokemon that may have survived off of a Focus Band. So flipping a heads and dealing that extra little 20 damage may be just enough to get you the knockouts that you need. Or even say you just want to put a Chansey in your active position and not even attack with it. Just let it absorb a bunch of damage. Meanwhile, you can kind of pseudo attack with Elekid from the bench, just using Playful Punch, and slowly chip away at your opponent's active. This makes Elekid very splashable. You could put it into almost any deck and find a little bit of use for it at one time or another during a match. However, because using Playful Punch is basically like attacking, where you are ending your turn in doing so, it's not really worth it to run more than one because, well, you can only use one Playful Punch per turn. Tyrogue, the anti-baby baby. Now there are a lot of cards that can OHKO a baby off of a coin flip, but Tyrogue is unique in that it is a baby itself. So not only can it threaten to knock out a Cleffa off of Smash Punch, you do have to hit 2 heads, but it can still be threatening, but you're also forcing your opponent to flip a coin for any kind of attack they want to use back. So even though a Pokemon might have the ability to OHKO a Cleffa off of a coin flip, they're probably not going to be able to force a Cleffa to flip a coin when it wants to try to Eek next turn. So if you really want to put pressure on your opponent's setup, Tyrogue is the way to go. Is it worth the risk to keep a Cleffa in if it could potentially be knocked out off of 2 lucky coin flips? Or do you want to retreat and just resort to other methods to set up, like a Professor Oak or Elm? Either way, any attack your opponent initiates against Tyrogue, they're going to have to flip a coin too. So not only can Tyrogue put pressure on an opposing Cleffa, which is extremely common in the first couple of turns, but it can also break some stalemates between 2 active Cleffas by just swapping in and putting pressure on your opponent's Cleffa and maybe forcing them to swap or try different tactics. Lastly, we have Smoochum, which is a baby Pokemon that you are not going to see in any competitive decks. It doesn't really have that much usefulness because Psykiss is an attack. If this was an ability or a power that you could use from the bench, then that would be a different story. Then this would be a very useful card. But as an attack, it's just bad. You have to flip a coin to even see if it works. And when it doesn't discard the special energy, it just shuffles it back into your opponent's deck, so it's still made available to them. In the base Neo format, you just had energy removal that could take care of this much easier and faster, and then even in Neo On, this card didn't see any play because there were just more reliable ways to discard energy off of your opponent. So sadly, Smoochum is the black sheep of Neo block baby Pokemon in that it didn't have any usefulness. All the other ones you could find some way to fit them into a deck and make them useful, but not so much for Smoochum. Let me know down below if you think this video was useful in explaining the utility of baby Pokemon, how and when to use them, and let me know what your favorite baby Pokemon card of Neo Block was. For more content, stay tuned to the channel. If you want to find me on Instagram, you can do so at DrunkShuckle, and I will see all of you next video.